On Christmas 2020, I sent a press release about The Devil and His Due, How Jordan Peterson Plagiarizes Adolf Hitler, to Mikhaila Peterson, daughter of Jordan Peterson. There followed a festive tweet from Mikhaila saying, "Here's a lovely Christmas message I received today from Troy Parfit about Jordan B. Peterson plagiarizing Hitler. Merry Christmas to you too, you sad sack of a man." Straight away, we see the logic. Mikhaila's father couldn't be plagiarizing Hitler because I am sad. We know about the straw man fallacy. Could this be the sad man fallacy? Naturally, Mikhaila's message was retweeted by her and her father's adoring fans, and she was showered with sympathetic comments effectively saying, There, don't let the crazy coattail riders get you down." Mikhaila's tweet was swiftly picked up by Sputnik News, which published an article called "Jordan Peterson's Daughter Blasts Author of a Book Alleging Her Father is Plagiarizing Hitler." The piece begins by describing Peterson as a, quote, self-styled fighter of political correctness, whatever that is, and then displays her tweet plus selected responses from loyal fans. Sputnik takes a shot at me for penning a satirical novel called The Bigot or How I Learned to Love Donald Trump, and praises Jordan Peterson for, quote, speaking out against Canadian legislation that requires using gender-neutral pronouns for people who identify as non-binary, end quote. The piece goes on to say, as an ardent advocate of free speech, Peterson has even launched an online platform to provide a censorship-free alternative to Facebook, Twitter, or YouTube, which have been under heavy criticism for blocking accounts of conservative content creators. The article concludes with a plug for Peterson's new book and the claim that he infuses his followers, or lobsters, with joy. Oh yes, Peterson's a happy camper, and his crustaceans a cheerful bunch. First, I'll address the article from Sputnik, second, Mikhaila's tweet, and third, Mikhaila directly. That Sputnik News would support Donald Trump and conservative commentators, while implying that conservatives are being silenced by non-conservatives, is unsurprising given that the outlet is the brainchild of Vladimir Putin and is owned and operated by the Russian government. In the last 18 months, Sputnik has published no fewer than 90 favorable articles about Jordan and Mikhaila Peterson. They tend to depict JP as a hero who rails against the evils of Western liberalism, including progressive education. Remember, Dr. Peterson claims to be warning of a resurgence of Nazism and communism, yet he and his daughter seem to have no problem receiving endorsements from an agency created by a man who is a former member of the KGB and who works tirelessly to stifle civil liberties at home and abroad. Russia may have lost its empire, but it can still play the spoiler, and the Petersons, stationed in Canada, seem happy to oblige. Sputnik News has been sanctioned and banned by Facebook, YouTube, and Twitter, the very social media outlets the government mouthpiece blamed for blocking conservative content creators, like them. In 2019, the British government banned Sputnik's journalists from attending the Global Conference for Media Freedom in London for, quote, their active role in spreading disinformation, end quote. And in 2016, United States intelligence issued a report outlining how Sputnik had interfered in the presidential election, which resulted in victory for Donald Trump. Regarding ThinkSpot, the platform was dreamed up by Jordan Peterson and Dave Rubin after one of Peterson's anti-feminist friends, Carl Benjamin, was banned from Patreon for using racial and homophobic slurs. As for ThinkSpot being a beacon of free speech, it's essentially an alt-right echo chamber that's been accused of censorship. Concerning Sputnik's claim that Peterson has spoken out against Canadian legislation which requires using gender-neutral pronouns for people who identify as non-binary, no such legislation exists, nor was it ever proposed. When Peterson claimed it was being proposed, he was, wait for it, lying. His crusade against Bill C-16 was a political stunt meant to attract attention and funding from potential cult followers, who signed on to his cause and donated tens of thousands of dollars per month while helping launch an obscure professor to international fame. When Peterson was asked by members of the Canadian Senate to cite the law that supposedly forced Canadians to make specific utterances, because the senators couldn't find it, he couldn't find it either. Neither could his lawyer, who admitted that Peterson's compelled speech law did not exist. But never mind the truth, Peterson went on to say that it did exist, and that it was the upshot of a communist plot. He also appeared on the Joe Rogan Experience and said the law was now on the books in Canada and the United States. With this double whopper, he was equating Canada and America to third-world dictatorships. As usual, he was signaling to his silly lobster military that they were being oppressed by democracy. Funny how Peterson's false claims match those of Moscow. In The Devil in His Due, I document how Peterson has repeatedly praised Hitler and Stalin, for example by manically comparing them to gods. For instance, he has said that Hitler is God the Father, and Stalin like God the Father. Bear in mind that the deity at the top of Peterson's dominance hierarchy, home of the lobsters, is God the Father. During a lecture at the University of Toronto, in which Peterson opined that the Cold War was still simmering, albeit on the back burner, he expressed praise for Alexander Dugin, a Russian fascist with links to the Kremlin, the Russian military, and Vladimir Putin. Here's what Mr. Peterson said about Mr. Dugin. Now, the guy who's advising Putin, his name is Alexander Dugin, and he's no admirer of Western liberalism. He thinks about it as fundamentally nihilistic. He thinks that its universal application would result in the dissolution of all local culture and the production of this sort of materialistic hyper-individuality, and he's an admirer of tradition, specifically Russian Orthodox tradition. Peterson could just as well have been describing himself. In 12 Rules for Life, he writes, "In the West, we have been withdrawing from our tradition, religion, and even nation-centered cultures, and are falling prey to meaninglessness." Dugin, who has a following among the Western alt-right, is worried about Western liberalism causing chaos. And Peterson, who also has a following among the Western alt-right, says we need order and an antidote to chaos. In 12 Rules for Life, he writes, "We require routine and tradition. That's order." Note how this statement sounds a little like his description of goose-stepping, which he has imitated in class, while saying, "You think about the Nazis and their goose-stepping. Every single person in the military becomes an identical unit, right? They're all uniform, and they're all imitating the dictator in an absolutely perfect way. And so, the dictator wants to impose strict uniformity on the entire population. That's order. Order." Again, in 12 Rules for Life, Peterson says that we require routine and tradition because that's order. And in class, he marveled at the strict uniformity of goose-stepping because that's order. He has said that the Nazis began by establishing order, but that order becomes tyranny. In other words, the Nazis went beyond order, and Peterson's new book is called Beyond Order, 12 More Rules for Life. Peterson has quoted a book of Hitler's speeches called My New Order, but of course Peterson's order couldn't be connected to Hitler's order. That's impossible. Besides, neo-Nazis don't exist. Alexander Dugin is an advocate of Christianity, and so is Jordan Peterson. By commandeering religion, a tyrant can encourage or force an entire population to transition from one dogmatic belief system to another. As Peterson tells his followers, quote, "The individual must be constrained, molded, even brought close to destruction by a restrictive disciplinary structure." End quote. Yes, like Russian Orthodoxy or authoritarianism. Clearly, this is not the language of a democrat. It's the language of a wannabe dictator. Again, Peterson said that Dugin was, quote, "no admirer of Western liberalism," end quote. And he has said, quote, "the purpose of liberal education is not to turn you into an avatar of democracy," end quote. And, quote, "freedom isn't the sort of thing that makes people happy, it's the sort of thing that makes people troublesome," end quote. In 12 Rules for Life, Peterson talks about the death of Socrates, depicting him as a troublemaker and urging us to take comfort in his demise. Apart from Jordan Peterson and Alexander Dugin, do you know who else promotes tradition, religion, and national culture while criticizing Western liberalism and democracy? Sputnik News, staunch supporter of Jordan B. Peterson and his daughter Mikhaila, a rising star in her own alt-right. 5 days before Mikhaila tweeted about me, she tweeted about herself being interviewed by Rebel News, Canada's answer to Breitbart News. On Mikhaila Peterson's podcast, she has spoken to Lauren Southern, former reporter for Rebel News and a notorious white nationalist. During their chat, Mikhaila complained that Black Lives Matter had, quote-unquote, infected the media, even the right-wing media, and that this was scary. Before Jordan Peterson rebranded himself as a self-help guru, which was around 2015, he identified as an expert on evil. One would naturally assume that an academic interested in evil, like the evil perpetrated in the Third Reich and the Soviet Union, would be opposed to such barbarism. However, in this case, such an assumption would be incorrect. As is well known, the professor's house is filled with hundreds of Soviet propaganda portraits, 200 by Mikhaila's estimation, and 400 by her father's. He says their function is to remind him of the horrors of the past. That's true, and again, one would assume that by horrors, he would mean that which is horrible. But that interpretation would also be incorrect. Turning to Mikhaila's tweet about me and her followers' consoling comments, she received over 800 responses, but only 2 people dealt with the evidence that I supply in the book. Their arguments are the same, since, in the single examples they selected, Peterson's and Hitler's language is identical. Therefore, the proposition that Peterson is plagiarizing Hitler is nonsensical. Of course, it could be nonsensical, but to determine whether that was so, you'd need to read the rest of the evidence. But they didn't. They ignored more than 3,100 pieces of evidence. Speaking of dismissing evidence, there was virtually no discussion of the press release's claims, specifically those in the following paragraph. In The Devil and His Due, Parfit argues that the Jordan Peterson phenomenon is a mainstream cult whose leader identifies as the savior, feigns Christian beliefs, glorifies Satan, discusses the Jewish question, encourages converts to slaughter goats and backyard sacrifices that ought to be sufficiently bloody, suggests that suicide can be an effective method for achieving revenge, touts banned substances as miracle cures, and teaches that the alt-right project is incomplete. These claims were either sidestepped or dismissed as ridiculous, but of course they were, because they're all true and evidenced in the book. The Jordan Peterson phenomenon is absolutely a cult. It's a little like QAnon, only its lunacy is better hidden. It has all the markings of a cult: a leader who sees himself as a messiah, promotes tradition and superstition, advocates illicit drugs, and discourages followers from pursuing a formal education while encouraging them to practice animal sacrifice so as to achieve spiritual transformation. What's most shocking about my claims is that they've gone unreported by the media. Mikhaila also snipped off the press release's final section, which I'll read to you now. Parfit wondered if Peterson might have been borrowing from Hitler after noticing that he frequently complimented the dictator. He says he's rescuing people from the clutches of the far right, but tells his followers that Hitler was a genius who was good at nearly everything. So I read Mein Kampf to see if he had found it inspiring. What I discovered was blatant academic theft. Parfit claims that Peterson's 12 Rules for Life and Maps of Meaning are riddled with language and ideas from Hitler's Mein Kampf, Second Book, Table Talk, and Speeches. Parfit is not the first to suggest that Peterson is a crypto-fascist or neo-Nazi. Historian Michael Nilsson has accused Peterson of making a, quote, barrage of revisionist falsehoods about Hitler and Nazism, end quote, noting his, quote, strangely generous framing of the Nazi leader, end quote, and his, quote, reluctance to use the word Holocaust, end quote. The CBC's Wendy Mesley and British GQ's Helen Lewis have questioned Peterson about why he posed with the Pepe the Frog flag, identified by the Anti-Defamation League as a hate symbol, and Peterson filed a lawsuit against Sir Wilfrid Laurier University after an educator compared him to Hitler. Peterson has said, "I'm no fan of the radical right. I've been lecturing about the dangers of Nazi totalitarianism for almost 3 decades. What I left out of the press release was that Pankaj Mishra wrote an article for the New York Book Review called Jordan Peterson and Fascist Mysticism. How did Peterson respond? He flew into a narcissistic rage, saying, "You arrogant, racist son of a bitch. You call me a fascist? You sanctimonious prick. If you were in my room at the moment, I'd slap you happily." And in an interview with Camille Paglia, a longtime advocate of child pornography, really, look it up, Jordan Peterson said it was lamentable that becoming quote-unquote physical was, quote, forbidden in discourse with women, and so I don't think men can control crazy women, end quote. He added that a crazy woman from Toronto had been, quote, organizing this movement, let's say, against me and some other free speech people, and she's quite, offensive. She compared us to Nazis, publicly, using the swastika, which wasn't really something I was all that fond of. But I'm defenseless against that kind of female insanity, because the techniques that I would use against a man who was employing those tactics are forbidden to me, end quote. Here, the courageous cult leader, role model for impressionable men, is fantasizing out loud about beating up a woman. Moving on, here's my message for Mikhaila. First, thanks for your Christmas gift, and a Merry Christmas to you too. Second, please ask your father, who identifies not only as a savior, but a hero, what he will do given that he knows about the book. Actually, he's almost certainly known about the book for months, because I've emailed him about it repeatedly. Didn't he tell you? Will he do what he did when historian Michael Nilsson questioned, in a Jewish newspaper, your father's strangely generous framing of Adolf Hitler, and remain silent? You can't tell a Jewish publication you want to slap them, can you? It's a little bit too obvious. Will he threaten to assault me, like he did with the book reviewer who labeled him a fascist, or the woman who branded him a Nazi? Alternatively, as a champion of free speech, according to Sputnik News, or the Kremlin, will he sue me like he did with Wilfrid Laurier University when a lecturer compared him to Hitler? Why do academics and journalists keep implying that your father is a fascist who's like Hitler? And when they do, why does he typically react like an angry child? Could it be they're cutting too close to the bone? Noam Chomsky has also made the connection. When asked for his opinion on JP, he admitted he agreed with him about some things, but clarified that that didn't mean much because, quote, there are some issues with which I would probably agree with Hitler, end quote. Mr. Chomsky added, quote, listen to what Jordan Peterson is saying. He's saying universities are dominated by the left. Now for him, the left is anybody to the left of Attila the Hun. In fact, universities are dominated by the right, but he's so far on the right that that looks like the left to him, end quote. Adolf Hitler, Attila the Hun, extremely far right. How will your dad respond to that? Will he have a tantrum? Will he remain silent? Will he sick his internet trolls on Noam Chomsky? And do you recall what your dad said about sicking his trolls on Kathy Newman at Channel 4 News? He said, quote, if I really wanted to sick my internet trolls on Channel 4 News, there would be nothing but broken windows and riots. Right, end quote. Also, your father is forever telling people that they're potential Nazis. So why does he become so upset when people say that he's the Nazi? In 2015, your father declared, no one likes to think they're a Nazi, but everyone is one. Look, it was 95% participation in Germany, and the only thing that distinguishes the average person from Hitler is that Hitler was an organizational genius. It's not a one-off, Mikhaila. I have your father on record as referring to Hitler as an organizational genius 3 times. Tell me, what was it that Hitler organized that made him such a genius? Could it have been the dehumanization, denaturalization, ghettoization, transportation, and eradication of Jews and others in facilities like Auschwitz, where your father is always saying he'd like to work? Why does he say he could enjoy working at a death camp? And why does he say, in the same sentence in 12 Rules for Life, that he could work at a death camp and torture children in a dungeon? Why does he say he wrote a chapter in 12 Rules for Life on child discipline after realizing he was a monster? Why does he say he can easily envision himself waiting at the railhead at Auschwitz-Birkenau, taking Jews off trains and working them to death, and that this would bring him happiness? Why would murdering Jews bring your dad happiness? Why does your father repeatedly say Hitler was brilliant, a genius, charismatic, impressive, and good at everything from art to oratory, to urban planning, to economics, to rallying ordinary Germans to his homicidal cause? We know your dad has meltdowns when people compare him to Hitler. Why does he fly off the handle when people criticize Hitler? Why, when Brett Weinstein implied that Hitler's understanding of biology was harebrained, did your father blow a fuse? Why is he so touchy when it comes to Hitler? Why does he defend Hitler and other Nazis, including Adolf Eichmann and Martin Heidegger? Eichmann was one of the Holocaust's chief logisticians, and Heidegger, as the rector of Freiburg University, made pro-Hitler speeches and then denied, after 1945, that he had any knowledge of the Holocaust. To be sure, neither Eichmann nor Heidegger expressed so much as a particle of remorse for their commitment to Adolf Hitler. Why does your father defend the infamous neo-Nazi and Holocaust denier Ernst Zundel? Why has he criticized the Canadian government for prosecuting Zundel and urged his lobster followers to wake up and push back against this sort of state tyranny? The phrase wake up is a neo-Nazi dog whistle. Why has your dad recounted and laughed at a so-called joke about Jews being gassed to death? Do you share his sense of humor? Is there something that you and your father find funny about innocent men, women, and children being tortured, experimented on, shot, gassed, and burned? Why did you disparage Black Lives Matter while interviewing a known white supremacist? Why in the world would you interview a white supremacist? And why, Mikhaila, are there more than 3,100 examples in my book where your father's language and Hitler's language range from uncannily similar to exactly the same? Given your father's obsession with Adolf Hitler, I ask you, how could that be? For it to be a coincidence, the natural overlap of language is all but a linguistic impossibility. Here's what I think. Your father won't say anything about the devil and his due. Instead, he'll let you and his barmy lobster army fight in the trenches while he stays well behind enemy lines. Besides, he likely knows what's in my book, reams of highly compelling evidence that prove beyond any reasonable doubt that he's been filching from the writings and speeches of Adolf Hitler ever since 1985, when he began writing Maps of Meaning, an endeavor he says was, quote, literally driving me insane, end quote. Odd that he said that, given that earlier in the book he talked about more than 105 nuclear detonations going off in his mind, and the emergence of a voice with eyes that began watching him and regulating his speech. I assume that includes his written speech, like the heaps of plagiarized speech I've found in his 2 books. Doubtless, your father knows that should he denounce the devil in his due, for him, it would almost certainly spell the beginning of the end. You know, the despotic Canadian government and their prosecution of neo-Nazis. And should he remain silent, his acolytes, who need to venerate some gaudy, wannabe strongman, may wonder why. They may think, how come JP, our exploratory hero, won't courageously slay the dragon, thereby transforming chaos into order? Maybe 1 or 2 will even figure out the truth, that their hero is really a coward, their fearsome leader, a vulgar neo-Nazi. To everyone else, thank you for listening. Please hit like and subscribe.